Walter Briggs was 62, retired, and had spent 4 years quietly saving for a granddaughter he adored, until the night his daughter-in-law put a price on seeing her. The private dining room at Falcon Ridge Chop House smelled like seared beef and candle wax when my daughter-in-law leaned across the table, smiled the way people smile when they've rehearsed something, and told me that if I wanted to see my own granddaughter again, I would need to start paying for the privilege. Before I tell you what I did in the 72 hours that followed, I want you to know something. I am not a violent man. I have never raised my voice at that table in my life. But there is a kind of stillness that comes over a man right before he stops being useful to people who never once said thank you. And that stillness found me that night, sitting in a leather chair I didn't choose, in a restaurant I didn't want to be in, listening to my son's wife explain the price of my own grandchild like she was reading me a menu. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 62 years old, a retired general contractor out of Asheville, North Carolina, and for most of my life I believed that love was something you proved by writing checks and staying quiet. I built houses for 38 years. I built one more thing besides, something nobody in my family knew about until the week everything came apart, and I will get to that. But first you need to understand how a man ends up sitting in a $500 dinner being told his granddaughter now has a price tag. My wife Donna passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, gone in 11 months. In the last weeks, when the hospice nurse had stepped out, and it was just the two of us in that quiet bedroom with the ceiling fan turning slow circles above us, Donna took my hand and said something I have carried every day since. "Walter," she said, "you have spent your whole life making sure everybody else is comfortable. Someday that is going to cost you something you can't get back. Promise me you'll notice before it does." I promised her. I meant it. And then I spent 6 more years not noticing at all. My son Dean is 31. He married a woman named Chelsea 4 years ago, a bright, sharp, ambitious woman who worked in property management and had opinions about everything from throw pillows to retirement accounts. I liked her at first. Donna had liked her too, in the brief window before the diagnosis, though I remember Donna saying once, quietly, in the kitchen, that Chelsea had a way of counting things. Counting favors, counting who owed who. I didn't understand what she meant until years later, sitting in that restaurant, watching the woman I'd welcomed into my family do exactly that, out loud, over a plate of seared scallops. Dean and Chelsea have a daughter, Lily. She is 4 years old. She has Donna's exact laugh, the one that starts in her shoulders before it ever reaches her mouth. And she is the reason I have gotten out of bed every single morning for 4 years running. I have missed almost nothing. Every dance recital, every pediatrician appointment when Dean's work schedule didn't allow it, every Sunday afternoon watching cartoons on my living room floor with her small feet pressed against my ribs. I never once thought of any of it as a favor. I thought of it as being her grandfather. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that Chelsea's mother, a woman named Vivian Cross, had spent the better part of 2 years quietly convincing her daughter that I was, in Vivian's words, an underutilized resource. Vivian lived in Charlotte, divorced twice, comfortable in the specific way people are comfortable when they have never once had to build the comfort themselves. She flew in that Friday for what Dean had described to me on the phone as a nice family dinner to celebrate Lily starting pre-kindergarten. I believed him completely. I wore my good blazer. I brought a card with $100 folded inside it for Lily's school supplies, because that is the kind of thing I have always done, quietly, without announcement, because Donna raised me to believe that love that needs an audience isn't really love at all. I picked the 3 of them up myself, my truck freshly washed, and drove us all downtown. When we walked into that private room at Falcon Ridge, Vivian was already seated at the head of the table, a glass of Cabernet in her hand, her reading glasses pushed up into a hairstyle that had clearly cost more than my truck payment. She looked at me the way you look at a stain on a tablecloth you're deciding whether to mention. The first 20 minutes went the way these dinners always go. Small talk. I asked Dean about work. I asked Lily about her new backpack, the one with the unicorn on it, and she launched into a 4-minute explanation of exactly which of her stuffed animals, were allowed to ride inside it. And for those 4 minutes, I forgot to be nervous about anything at all. Then the appetizers were cleared, and Vivian set her wine glass down with a small, deliberate click, and the temperature of the room changed. "Walter," she said, folding her hands on the table like she was about to deliver a toast, "Chelsea and I have been talking, and we think it's time the four of us had an honest conversation about Lily's care arrangement going forward." I remember setting down my fork very carefully. "Of course," I said. "What did you have in mind?" Chelsea took over from there, and I want to be precise about what she said, because I have replayed it enough times since that I could recite it in my sleep. She said that with pre-K starting, their after-school costs were going up. That daycare in Asheville now runs close to $2,000 a month for full coverage, that she and Dean had discussed it and agreed. The fairest solution was for me to take on formal paid babysitting duties, invoiced on a set schedule, rather than the informal setup we'd had for 4 years. She used the word invoiced, at a dinner table. About my own grandchild. I want you to understand what she was actually proposing, because it wasn't help, and it wasn't a schedule. It was a toll gate. She wanted $400 a week, cash or transfer, for the privilege of watching a little girl I had already been watching, gladly. For 4 years, every single time either of them needed a break, a night out, a work trip, a Saturday to themselves, and she framed it, carefully, deliberately, as the price of continued access. "If the arrangement wasn't formalized," she said, looking directly at me with an expression I can only describe as pleasant, "then it might make more sense to look into licensed after-school care instead, for consistency's sake, for Lily's sake, of course." I sat there for a long moment, not because I didn't understand her, because I understood her completely, and I was waiting to see if my son was going to say anything at all. He didn't. Dean stared at the breadbasket like it had personally wronged him, the way he does when a room gets too heavy for him to carry his share of it. He has done this since he was a boy. Donna used to call it his disappearing act, the way he could be sitting right in front of you and somehow not be present for the hardest parts of a conversation. I used to find it forgivable. That night, watching him say nothing while his wife priced out access to my own grandchild, I found it something closer to unbearable. Vivian was the one who filled the silence, because Vivian always fills the silence. She leaned back in her chair with the specific comfort of someone who has never once paid a consequence for her own words, and she said, "Walter, don't make this uncomfortable. It's simply practical. You're retired. You have the time. And frankly, it would be good for you to feel useful again instead of just, well, floating around that big empty house all by yourself. This way, everybody wins." I felt something in my chest that I want to describe honestly, because I think a lot of people watching this have felt it too, and never had the words for it. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the particular quiet devastation of hearing the thing you have given freely, out of love, for years, recast in a single sentence as a burden you should be grateful to be allowed to carry, for a fee, on somebody else's schedule. "That is unkind, Vivian," I said. My voice came out even, which surprised me. "And it has nothing to do with practicality. You are talking about charging me to spend time with my own granddaughter." Chelsea set her wineglass down with a sharp tap, and her expression shifted into something colder. "Dad," she said, "that's not what this is, and you know it. This is about boundaries. You've gotten used to unlimited access, and now that we're formalizing it, suddenly it feels like an insult. If the terms don't work for you, that's fine. We can absolutely go the daycare route instead. Nobody's forcing you into anything." There it was. Nobody's forcing you into anything. Said with the exact same confident calm as a person telling you the water is fine right before they push you into the deep end. She wasn't threatening me. She wanted me to understand, gently, reasonably, that the choice was entirely mine. Pay for the right to see my granddaughter on my terms, or lose regular access to her altogether, replaced by a stranger in a daycare center 3 towns over, while I sat home in that big empty house Vivian had so helpfully mentioned. I looked at Lily. She had slid down in her booster seat and was quietly feeding a piece of bread to an imaginary friend under the table, humming to herself, completely unaware that the adults around her were negotiating her afternoons like a lease agreement. I looked at Dean, still studying the breadbasket. I looked at Chelsea, who was watching me now with the calm, patient expression of someone who has already decided how this evening ends and is simply waiting for me to catch up. Something in me went very quiet and very clear. I have felt that particular stillness exactly twice in my life. Once, standing outside an operating room while surgeons worked to save Donna's mother 40 years ago. And that night, at that table, over a half-eaten fillet I could no longer taste, I picked up my napkin, folded it once, and set it beside my plate. You know what? I said, that's actually a very fair point, Chelsea. Let's talk terms. Chelsea's eyebrows lifted just slightly, the first crack in that composed surface. Vivian smiled the smile of a woman who believes she has already won. Dean finally looked up from the breadbasket, and for one unguarded second, I saw something in his face that looked almost like relief, like some small part of him had been hoping, quietly, that I would push back on any of this, on any of it at all, at any point in the last 2 years. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on. Everyone at that table thought they knew exactly how the rest of the evening and the rest of my life was going to go. They had no idea I had spent 38 years building things load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, and I knew precisely how a structure comes apart when you remove the one piece nobody thought to check. I raised my hand and caught the attention of our waiter. I asked for the check, the full check, all 4 of us. And while we waited, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the card I had brought for Lily, the one with $100 folded inside it for her school supplies. I slid it across the table to Dean, not Chelsea. Dean, and I said, this is for Lily. Buy her the backpack she actually wants, not the one on sale. Then I signed the check when it came, stood and settled my jacket over my shoulders. Thank you for the evening, I said. I meant it. In a way none of them understood yet. I walked to the edge of the private room, and I paused, just once, without turning around. I drove all 3 of you here tonight, I said, loud enough to be heard clearly over the low restaurant music. You'll want to call a car for the ride home. And Chelsea, I'll be in touch about those terms you mentioned. I think you're going to find I take contracts a lot more seriously than you expect. I walked out into the cool October night, and I did not look back once. I did not cry on the drive home. I did not grip the steering wheel or replay every word Vivian had thrown across that table. I drove the way I have driven 10,000 times before, hands steady, eyes forward, the familiar streets of Asheville sliding past my windows like a film I'd already memorized. But somewhere around the 3rd stoplight, a thought surfaced that I hadn't let myself think in 4 years, not directly, not in those exact words. I thought about the cedar toolbox in my garage, the one that had belonged to my own father, and the small brass-latched drawer inside it that nobody but me had ever opened. When I got home, the house felt the way it always does after a hard evening, too quiet, too large for one person, and a truck full of memories. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door, and instead of going straight to bed, I walked out to the garage, flipped on the single bare bulb over the workbench, and opened that cedar toolbox for the first time in almost a year. Inside, beneath the layers of my father's old chisels and a coffee can of mismatched screws, was a manila envelope, soft at the corners from handling, and a small hardcover ledger with Lily's name written on the first page in my own handwriting. I sat down on the workbench stool, the same stool I'd sat on the night Donna told me she was tired, the night before her diagnosis, and I opened that ledger for the first time in months, 4 years of entries. Small amounts, mostly. $50 here, $100 there. Whatever I could set aside after the mortgage and the utilities and my own modest needs. On the inside cover, in Donna's handwriting, not mine, was a single line she had written the month before she died, when Lily was barely 3 months old, and this whole arrangement had been her idea in the first place. For our girl's future, not a word of it he'll grow into, not a college fund for someday. Her handwriting, her words, her wish, tucked inside a box in my garage that not one member of my family had ever thought to ask about. I sat there a long time with that ledger open on my knee, and I thought about Chelsea's voice at that table, invoiced, formalized terms. I thought about Vivian's floating around that big empty house, and I thought for the first time in longer than I care to admit about a version of myself who stopped absorbing things that deserved to be returned. My phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Chelsea. We need to discuss this like adults tomorrow. I'd like specific numbers by Monday. I read it twice. I did not respond. Instead, I picked up the ledger, closed it, and carried it inside to the kitchen table, where I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled up the contact list on my phone. I scrolled past Dean's name. I scrolled past Chelsea's. I stopped on a name I hadn't called in almost 2 years. A man named Roger Ashby, who had built houses beside me for 2 decades before he went back to school in his 40s, and became, of all things, a family law attorney specializing in exactly the kind of arrangement I now understood, with total clarity, that I needed to make. It was almost 11 at night. I looked at his name for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then I thought about Lily under that table, humming to her imaginary friend, completely unaware that the adults around her had just spent an entire dinner deciding what she was worth per hour. I made the call. Roger picked up on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and mild confusion at seeing my name at that hour. Walter Briggs, he said. Either somebody died or you finally left that recliner of yours. I told him neither. I told him everything, start to finish, the invoice, the $400 a week, the daycare threat, Vivian's floating around that big empty house. Roger didn't interrupt once, which is rarer in a lawyer than people think. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked me the one question that changed the entire shape of what came next. Walter, he said, how many years have you been providing regular, documented childcare for that little girl? 4, I told him. Since she was 3 months old. Do you have anything in writing? Texts, a calendar, anything showing the pattern? I thought about it, and the answer surprised me. Yes. 4 years of text messages from Dean and Chelsea, dropping her off, thanking me, sometimes not thanking me, sometimes just sending an address and a time. 4 years of my own calendar, marked in ink, every single Tuesday and every other Saturday, going back to the month Lily was born. I had never once thought of it as evidence. I had thought of it as being her grandfather. Roger exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. Walter, he said, what you're describing isn't a favor anymore. In this state, when a grandparent provides that kind of consistent, ongoing care over that kind of time frame, courts take it seriously if that access is suddenly and unilaterally cut off, especially if it's being used as financial leverage. What Chelsea did tonight, dressing up a demand for cash as a childcare boundary, that's not a boundary, that's coercion, and if you want, we can make it very clear in writing exactly what that means for both of you going forward. I sat at my kitchen table with the ledger open in front of me, Donna's handwriting catching the kitchen light, and I told Roger I wanted to do this the right way. Not to punish anybody. Not to win some kind of contest with a woman in Charlotte who had never once asked me a single question about my own life. I wanted it formalized, the way Chelsea herself had used that word at dinner, except formalized on terms that actually protected Lily, and that actually told the truth about who had shown up for 4 straight years and who had shown up to negotiate a fee. Roger told me he could have a letter drafted by Monday morning, outlining a proposed grandparent visitation schedule based on our documented history, along with something else I hadn't even thought to ask for. He told me that in cases where a grandparent has been the primary informal caregiver, and where financial coercion can be documented, it is sometimes possible to petition for a small trust protection order, ensuring that any funds set aside for the child's benefit can't be redirected or accessed by anyone but the child herself once she comes of age, regardless of what happens between the adults around her. I hadn't told him about the ledger yet. When I did, when I read him Donna's line out loud, for our girl's future, there was a long pause on the other end of the phone, and then Roger said quietly, for a hard-nosed contract lawyer, Walter, that's the kind of thing that makes a judge's whole afternoon. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat up at the kitchen table with the ledger, a legal pad, and 4 years of text messages pulled up on my phone, highlighting every drop-off, every last-minute request, every single word thank you that Chelsea had occasionally remembered to send. By the time the sun came up over the ridge behind my house, I had a stack of paper 11 pages thick, and a decision made that I would not be unmaking, no matter what showed up at my door that Saturday. And something did show up at my door that Saturday, right on schedule, the way it always had. I heard the stroller wheels on the walkway first, then Lily's small, excited voice asking if Grandpa Walter had the good crayons out. Then underneath it, Chelsea's voice, clipped and businesslike, telling someone on the phone she'd call them back in 5. I did not open the door right away. I stood in my front hallway and I let the moment stretch, because for the first time in 4 years, I understood exactly what I was choosing to say yes to, and I wanted to be certain before I said it. When I finally opened the door, Chelsea's smile was already halfway assembled, the smile of a woman expecting the same arrangement she'd had every Saturday since Lily was born: drop the child, collect her free labor, drive off toward her own afternoon. "Morning, Walter," she said, already turning to set the diaper bag down inside my doorway the way she always did, without asking. "I have a showing at 11 and then lunch with my mother, so I should be back by 4, maybe 5. I didn't move to take the diaper bag. "I want to talk about yesterday first," I said. Chelsea's eyes flicked up to mine, and I watched her recalibrate quickly, the way people do when a script they've relied on suddenly stops working. "Walter," she said, "we don't need to make a whole thing out of this on my doorstep with Lily right here." "You're right," I said. "We don't. So I'm going to make it very simple." I picked up an envelope I had left on the front hall table, the corner of it just visible past the doorframe, and I held it out to her. Inside is a letter from my attorney. It outlines a formal court-recognized visitation and childcare schedule based on the last 4 years, at no cost, because grandparents in this state don't get invoiced for loving their grandchildren. It also outlines what happens if that access gets restricted or made conditional on payment going forward. I'd read it carefully before you show it to your mother. I watched something move behind Chelsea's eyes, fast, calculating, the exact expression I imagine she wears in a negotiation over a commercial lease. "Is that a threat?" she said. "No," I said. "It's a boundary. You used that word yesterday. I'm just the one actually using it correctly." She didn't take the envelope right away. Lily, small and oblivious, tugged at my hand and asked if we could do the puzzle with the dinosaurs today. And for one whole minute, standing on my own front porch, I looked down at my granddaughter and felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger at all. It was grief, plain and simple, for every version of this relationship that should never have needed a letter from a lawyer to protect it. Chelsea finally took the envelope. She didn't open it in front of me. She said, "We'll be discussing this as a family," and walked back down my front path with a stiffness in her spine I had never seen before, leaving Lily's diaper bag exactly where it sat, on my doorstep, because underneath everything else, some habits are simply too old to break in a single Saturday. I want to tell you what happened over the following 2 weeks, because the story didn't end on that porch, not even close. Roger's letter did exactly what a well-drafted letter is supposed to do. It didn't threaten anyone. It simply stated facts, dated, documented, undeniable, and it made clear that if Dean and Chelsea attempted to restrict my access to Lily as retaliation for declining their fee or as leverage in any future disagreement, I had 4 years of evidence and legal standing to petition for a formal schedule that a family court would very likely uphold. Chelsea, I learned later, showed the letter to exactly one person before she showed it to Dean, and that person was her mother. Vivian called me directly 2 days later. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did, because it told me something I needed to know. "Walter," she said, her voice bright and hard at the same time, the way ice sounds right before it cracks, "this is completely unnecessary. We are a family. Families don't lawyer up over a simple financial conversation." "You're right," I said. "Families don't. But you weren't having a financial conversation, Vivian. You were pricing access to a 4-year-old like she was a rental unit, and you did it at a dinner table in front of her, while she fed bread to an imaginary friend under the tablecloth." I let that sit for a second. Then I said, I think what actually happened is that you convinced your daughter I was a resource to be managed instead of a father who's been showing up every single week for 4 years. And now that I've shown I understand exactly what that costs, the arithmetic doesn't work in your favor anymore. There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then Vivian said, quieter, the frame around her voice gone entirely, "This isn't about the money, Walter. It's about Chelsea feeling like she's drowning and nobody in that house helping her feel like she has any control over anything." It was the first honest thing she had ever said to me. I want you to notice that, because it matters later. Underneath the ice and the calculation, there was a woman watching her own daughter struggle and reaching for the only lever she knew how to pull: money, terms, invoices. Because somewhere along the way, Vivian had learned that control was the closest thing to safety she could offer anybody. It didn't make what she did to me at that table right. But it made her human, and it made what came next a great deal more complicated than a simple villain getting what she deserved. I told Vivian I understood that Chelsea might be overwhelmed. I told her that overwhelmed people deserve support, not a business arrangement with a 4-year-old's grandfather. And then I told her something I hadn't planned to say until the words were already out of my mouth. I told her that Donna, my late wife, had started a fund for Lily the month she was born, quietly, faithfully, 4 years running, and that as of that morning, on my attorney's advice, that fund was now held in an irrevocable trust that neither Chelsea, nor Dean, nor I could access for any purpose other than Lily's direct benefit, verified by receipts, until she turned 18. I did that, I told Vivian, so that no one, ever again, gets to use my granddaughter's future as a negotiating chip at a dinner table. Not you. Not Chelsea. Not even me, if I'm honest, because grief makes people do strange things with money, and I wanted this protected from all of it, including myself. Vivian didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every ounce of its usual polish. "That's a good thing to have done, Walter," she said, and hung up before I could respond. The public reckoning, the one I hadn't planned and didn't want, came 10 days later, at Lily's pre-kindergarten open house, in the small gymnasium of Ridgeline Elementary, under fluorescent lights and construction paper banners that said "Welcome Little Learners" in 6 different colors. I was there because I had been invited, formally, in writing, as part of the schedule Roger had drafted. Dean was there. Chelsea was there, and Vivian, who I hadn't expected, had flown back in for the weekend, standing near the cookie table in a blazer that did not belong in a gymnasium full of 4-year-olds. Chelsea found me near the reading corner, where I was helping Lily arrange a row of stuffed animals along a bookshelf according to a system only she understood. Her voice was low, tight, urgent in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "Walter," she said, "can we talk outside for a second?" I followed her into the hallway. She stood with her arms crossed, and for the first time since that dinner at Falcon Ridge, I watched the composed surface come apart completely. "I need you to know something," she said, her voice cracking on the second half of the sentence. "I've been managing 3 properties, a full-time job, and a 4-year-old with almost no help from Dean's schedule. And when my mother suggested formalizing your time with Lily, it felt like the only piece of my life I actually had any control over. I know how it sounded. I know how it looked. I'm not proud of it. I stood there in that hallway, under a paper banner shaped like a sun, and I felt the anger I had been carrying for 2 weeks shift into something else entirely, something closer to recognition. I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning," I told her. "I felt it every single day for the 11 months I watched my wife die. But, Chelsea, drowning doesn't give you the right to charge a 4-year-old's grandfather admission to his own granddaughter's life. If you needed help, you should have asked me for help. I would have given you anything you actually needed. What I won't do, not ever again, is pay a toll to love my own family." She didn't argue. She nodded, once, slowly, the way a person nods when they've finally heard something true and don't have the energy left to fight it. We walked back into the gymnasium together, not fixed, not finished, but different than we'd been an hour before. Dean was crouched by the reading corner, laughing at something Lily had said, and when he looked up and saw the 2 of us walking in side by side, Something in his shoulders came down an inch, the way a man's shoulders drop when a storm he's been bracing for changes direction and passes somewhere else instead. Vivian caught my eye across the room, near the cookie table, and for once she didn't look away first. She lifted her cup of gymnasium coffee in something that might, in poor lighting, have passed for a toast, and I understood it for what it was. Not an apology. Not yet. Just an acknowledgement from one grieving, difficult, imperfect person to another that the game had changed, and that I had made it very clear I would not be playing the old version of it again. That night, after I'd driven home, after I'd hung my jacket on its hook and stood for a long moment in my too-quiet kitchen, my phone rang. Dean's name on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit, the old habit of waiting for him to disappear into the breadbasket the way he always did when things got hard. I answered instead. "Dad," he said, and his voice was different than I'd heard it in years. Steady in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with finally standing still long enough to say something true. "Chelsea told me everything tonight, about the dinner, about what she asked you to do, and she told me about the trust, about Mom's ledger, about all of it. I didn't know any of it, Dad. Not the money you'd been setting aside since Lily was born, not what Mom wrote in that book, none of it." "I know," I said. "That's not an excuse for the 4 years before it. But I know there was a long silence, the kind that used to make me nervous, back when I still thought silence from my son meant he was disappearing again. This time I understood it differently. This time I let it sit. "I want to come by Sunday," he said finally. "Just me and Lily. I want to see the ledger. I want to see what Mom wrote. And Dad, I want to actually start showing up, not just dropping her off and driving away. I've been doing that for 4 years and telling myself it was fine because you never once complained. I never complained because I loved doing it," I told him. "But you're right that loving something doesn't mean it should cost you nothing to receive it." He came Sunday. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat 2 weeks earlier, making the hardest phone call of my year, and I opened that cedar toolbox in front of him for the first time in his adult life. I watched my 31-year-old son read his mother's handwriting for our girl's future, and I watched something in him break open the same way it had broken open in me, quietly, without drama, the particular grief of understanding exactly how much you'd been given by people too humble to ever mention it. I want to tell you what changed after that Sunday, because it wasn't sudden, and it wasn't a single conversation that fixed 4 years of habits. It was smaller than that, and slower, and in my experience, that is the only kind of change that ever actually holds. Dean started showing up. Not just dropping off, not just collecting, but staying. That first Tuesday after our phone call, he arrived 20 minutes early with 2 coffees, one for himself and one for me, black, the way I've taken it since before he was born, and he sat on my back porch while Lily ran through the sprinkler, and he asked me questions about his mother. I don't think he'd ever let himself ask before. What she was like before he was born, what she'd said in those last weeks, whether I thought she'd be proud of the man he was becoming, or whether she'd have had some sharp, loving thing to say about the 4 years he'd spent looking away from the hardest parts of his own marriage. I told him the truth, because I'd learned by then that anything less than the truth just becomes another debt somebody has to pay down later. I told him his mother would have loved him fiercely, and told him exactly what he needed to hear, whether he wanted to hear it or not, and that the second part was a gift, not a punishment, even when it stung. He sat with that for a long time, watching his daughter chase water across my lawn, and then he said something I've held on to since. "I think I've spent my whole marriage disappearing, whenever things got hard, Dad. The same way I used to disappear at your dinner table. I think I learned that from watching you do it for 30 years and thinking it looked like peace." That one landed harder than anything Vivian or Chelsea had ever said to me, because it was true, and because it came from someone I loved, and because I recognized, sitting there on my own porch, that the quiet, absorbing, keep-the-peace version of myself I had spent decades being wasn't just something I had done to myself. It was something I had handed down, without ever meaning to, The way you hand down a tool you don't realize is broken until you watch your own child try to use it and cut himself on the same edge that's been nicking you for years. I'm sorry, I told him. Not because I'd ever intended to teach you that silence was strength. But I did, and I'm sorry, and I'd like the chance to teach you something truer than that from here on, if you'll let me. He let me. Over the following weeks, that became the real story underneath the story. Quieter than the lawyer's letter, quieter than the trust, quieter than any single confrontation at any single table. A father and a son, slowly, deliberately, unlearning the same inherited habit of disappearing. One Tuesday afternoon at a time, Chelsea's change came slower. And I want to be honest about that too, because I don't think this kind of story is worth telling if it pretends every person transforms at the same speed, or completely, or without setbacks along the way. She apologized to me properly, in person 3 weeks after the open house, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea she barely touched. And she told me she'd started seeing a counselor, at Dean's suggestion, to work through what she called her scarcity thinking, a phrase she said her therapist had given her for the particular fear that makes a person start pricing love before somebody else can take it away from her for free. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. I also told her that appreciating it didn't erase what she'd said at that dinner table in front of her own daughter, and that trust, once spent like that, doesn't come back at the same exchange rate it left at. She nodded. She didn't argue. And over the months that followed, she proved it the only way that has ever actually meant anything to me, not with a single grand gesture, but with small, repeated, unglamorous consistency. She started texting me on her own, unprompted, just to tell me something funny Lily had said. She started asking before assuming, is it all right if, instead of simply arriving. Small things. The kind of things that don't make it into a highlight reel, but that, stacked up over enough Tuesdays, are the entire actual substance of trust being rebuilt. Vivian's turn came the way I least expected it, on a phone call I almost didn't take, 6 weeks after that dinner at Falcon Ridge. She called to tell me she was flying in for Lily's birthday, and instead of announcing it the way she once would have, she asked carefully, almost shyly, whether that would be all right with me, given everything. I told her it would. There was a pause, and then she said something I still think about. I grew up the way I made Chelsea feel that night, Walter, she said. My own mother made me feel like I had to earn my place at every table I ever sat at. I promised myself I'd never do that to my own daughter, and instead I taught her to do it to someone else's family. I don't expect you to forgive that quickly. I just wanted you to know I see it now, clearly, and I'm not proud of what it cost your family to get me there. It was, I think, the most honest sentence Vivian Cross had ever said to me, and I have come to believe that people rarely change because they're told the truth once, loudly, at a dinner table. They change because somebody draws a clear enough line that the old way simply stops working, and they're left standing there with no choice but to find a new one. I hadn't set out to teach Vivian anything. I had only set out to stop paying, in every sense of that word, for the privilege of loving my own family. But sometimes the boundary you draw for yourself ends up being the exact thing somebody else needed to finally see themselves clearly. Lily's 5th birthday came that spring, in my backyard, under the same oak tree Donna had planted the year we bought the house, its branches finally wide enough to throw real shade across the whole lawn. Dean grilled. Chelsea organized a scavenger hunt with a level of detail that told me exactly how much of herself she'd started pouring back into things that couldn't be invoiced. Vivian arrived with a homemade cake instead of a store-bought one, her first attempt at baking in probably 20 years, lopsided and a little burnt at one edge, and Lily declared it the best cake she had ever had in her whole entire life, which at 5 years old was a fairly short list. But she meant every word of it, and so did I when I said the same thing a moment later. I brought out the cedar toolbox that afternoon, set it on the picnic table, and showed Lily, for the first time, the ledger with her name on the first page. She couldn't read most of it yet, but she understood enough that her grandmother, whom she had never met, had started saving for her before she was even 3 months old, because she wanted her to have choices someday that nobody could take away from her or put a price on. Grandpa, Lily said, tracing her small finger over her own name in Donna's handwriting. Was Grandma Donna nice? She was the nicest, most stubborn woman I ever met, I told her. And everyone at that table laughed, the good kind of laugh. The kind that makes grief feel less like a wound and more like a room you can finally sit inside comfortably. Roger came by that evening too, after most of the guests had gone, dropping off a folder he'd promised me weeks earlier, the finalized trust paperwork, signed, sealed, filed with the county. He stayed for a slice of Vivian's lopsided cake, standing at my kitchen counter in his work boots, and he watched Dean chase Lily around the yard for a minute before he turned to me and said, "You know, Walter, in 30 years of family law, I've drafted 100 documents meant to protect a kid's money. I don't think I've ever drafted one that actually changed how a family talked to each other. Most people, once the paperwork's done, that's the end of it. You went and used yours as a beginning instead." I hadn't thought of it that way until he said it out loud, but he was right. The letter, the trust, the whole quiet legal architecture Roger had built for me in those first frantic days, none of it had been the point. It had only ever been the thing sturdy enough to stand on while the actual work happened around it. The slow work of a son learning to stop disappearing, a daughter-in-law learning to stop pricing what should be freely given, a grandmother learning that the fear she'd carried her whole life didn't have to be the only inheritance she left behind. Nadine Pruitt, my neighbor 3 houses down, wandered over around dusk with a plate of her own cornbread, the kind she'd been bringing me every few weeks since Donna passed, whether I asked for it or not. She'd watched the whole spring unfold from her kitchen window, the lawyer's car in my driveway that first week, the slow return of Dean's truck on weeknights instead of just Saturdays, the gradual, visible thaw of a family finding its way back to something honest. She settled into the chair Vivian had vacated and said, without much preamble the way Nadine says most things, "I'll tell you what, Walter Briggs. I've lived next to a lot of families on this street over the years. Most of them, when trouble comes, they get quieter. Yours got louder, and then it got kinder. That's the rare version. Hold on to it." I told her I intended to. And I meant it in a way I don't think I could have explained to her fully, not without telling her about a promise made in a hospice bedroom 6 years earlier, or about a stillness that had settled over me in a steakhouse booth on an October night, or about the particular relief of finally becoming, at 62, the kind of man his late wife had always believed he had it in him to be. Some things you don't explain. You just let people watch you live them out, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, until the living itself becomes the explanation. Later, after the cake had been eaten, and the presents opened and Dean was walking a sugar-wired Lily in slow circles around the yard, trying to talk her down toward a nap, Vivian sat down beside me on the porch steps, 2 cups of coffee between us, and she said quietly, watching her granddaughter chase fireflies that weren't out yet but that Lily was certain she could see anyway, "You built something worth protecting here, Walter." I'm sorry it took almost losing it for me to understand that. I looked out at my son, steadier now than I had seen him in years, at my daughter-in-law, learning slowly how to ask instead of assume, at my granddaughter, running barefoot through grass her grandmother had once mowed by hand every single Saturday morning for 2 decades, and I thought about that stillness that had come over me at Falcon Ridge, the one I'd told you about at the very beginning of this story, the one that arrived right before I stopped being useful to people in the exact shape they had come to expect. I don't think what I did that night was revenge, and I don't think revenge is even the right word for any of it, though I know that's the word this story probably got clicked on for. What I did was simpler than that, and harder. I stopped confusing love with obligation, and silence with peace. The same 2 things my late wife warned me, in her very last weeks, that I would need to learn to tell apart, before they cost me something I couldn't get back. If you see yourself anywhere in this story, in the quiet man who keeps paying so nobody has to be uncomfortable, in the son who disappears into the breadbasket instead of standing up for the people he loves, in the daughter-in-law who learned somewhere along the way that love has to be earned before it's given, hear me on this one thing. You do not have to burn your whole family down to draw a line. But you do have to draw it clearly, calmly. before the people around you draw it for you, in the shape of an invoice at a dinner table. Over a meal you can no longer taste. My granddaughter is 5 years old now. She still runs to meet my truck in the driveway every single Tuesday. And no one has ever again suggested, at any table, in any tone, that seeing her should cost anyone a single dollar. The cedar toolbox sits on a shelf in my garage now, not hidden anymore, not a secret kept from anyone, just a family object like any other, the way a good story eventually stops being a wound and becomes, instead, simply part of the furniture of a life well lived. Some Sundays, when the whole family gathers under that oak tree, I catch myself thinking about the man I was walking into Falcon Ridge Chope House that October night, the one who would have paid the checks, smiled, and absorbed the whole evening without a word, and I feel something for him that isn't quite pity and isn't quite pride, just recognition, just gratitude that he finally, at 62 years old, remembered a promise he'd made to a dying woman years earlier and picked up the phone. If this story meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, where do you draw your line? Thank you for staying with me until the very end.